Okay, folks, I think I do anticipate we'll have some more people coming in, but I think we want to start and listen to what Dan has to say. It feels nice. It's kind of a little bit like a family here. The last time I heard an in-depth version of this was Dan's dissertation defense a few years ago, and it's obviously matured and grown since that point. But for me, the idea of having someone coming and doing their dissertation here and coming back and presenting their book is great. One of my colleagues, I said, I've got to go to a book talk, and she said, your book talk? And I said, no, better, Dan's book talk. And it actually really feels that way to see this book come to the market and come to the world of development. I was watching some tweets that were coming out about the book today, and we were talking about Alice Evans' comment, which was, if anybody knows Alice, was as usual effusive and informed and on the mark. It wasn't the one that I thought was great. I think the best one was actually on the Facebook page, which was someone saying, as a career bureaucrat, this is the book that I think I would have written for myself. And I think that this is where this is going to find an interesting and important market, partly because of what is written in there, is that I think that this is something that many successful bureaucrats will relate to because they have had to work out the space between autonomy and control, and between exercising their talent and following the firm. And I think more than that, the way that you've written it is a way that those bureaucrats are going to be able to read it. And so that's why I'm really excited to see it come to the market, because I think it's an important book, and it's a book that's going to get a lot of traction. I just also love, Michael, can you lift up the book? You know, I've had two books, and they both have much worse covers than this. I need to find out from you, here it is, how you managed to get such a great cover. But anyway, what we're going to do is Dan is going to present the book and give some of the thoughts on his book, and then we'll have an open session where we can ask him questions, get some answers, and let's go for it.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me here. Thanks so much for the kind words. You know, if I could say that, it's funny the point you just made about kind of being able to speak to bureaucrats about their lives, because both you and Michael at separate times made the point to me that when you felt best about your own work was when someone came up to you after sort of a session, after an intervention, and said, look, this is my life, this is what I live. And the reason I remember that very saliently is it was a touchstone for me as I thought about writing this book, as I thought about the kind of research I wanted to do as your student and now as a faculty member. And let me also say that the last time I was in this room talking about anything, I think Rohit may have been there. Exactly. I gave my practice job talk, and I can't, perhaps I shouldn't identify the faculty member, but maybe 10 minutes in, 15 minutes in, a faculty member said, I think the ideas here are pretty interesting, but this presentation is absolute crap. I'm about to walk out right now, so let's hope I beat that bar. And there is some progress. If you want to walk out after 15 minutes, just let me know. I'll understand that things have not gone our way. So, and I'll come back to the cover at the end. So let's start here, which is, for those in the room, the kind of scene that maybe resonates with more of you than with many audiences. So this is the scene out my window in Monrovia, Liberia, about a decade ago. At the time, I was the aid management advisor to the Minister of Finance in Liberia, and I took this picture for no research-related reason. I took this picture because, due to a World Bank-funded project, the windows had just been replaced, and as a result, the windows were clean. And on what I suspected would be the only day that I would have clean windows and thus be able to kind of, take the photo of what had been out my window all these months and years, I took a picture. But as I look at it now, it occurs to me that there a range of things that we can think of clear, concrete development projects, what Matt and Michael and Lant have referred to as blueprint projects, working fairly effectively, perhaps, right? We could imagine this building that, this government building that had been destroyed by the war in the top right that we might need to reconstruct. We can imagine the bridge that's fallen down and the project that could build that bridge with a clear blueprint, clearly defined steps, a clear plan. We could imagine turning on this traffic light. There are no working traffic lights in the country at this time in 2007. And we could also imagine turning on the lights in the Ministry of Transportation just behind the traffic light that they are presumably responsible for. The reason the lights are off inside the ministry at midday is because there's no electricity grid. There's no way to turn on the power except to run an expensive generator. And so while I can circle things like those on this photo, of course I can't put a circle around how you would build the capacity of that ministry to actually manage that that transportation system, that electricity system, that traffic light system. I can't circle the things we might think might be most relevant to all these folks on the street here, all these folks engaged in petty commerce. I can't say anything about the lives of most of these people in these taxis and how to improve their lives, not the structures around their lives, but their actual opportunity set. And you know, it strikes me that this has a lot of echoes with the work of BSC, as I'll return to in a minute. So key building blocks of my theory here, just very briefly. So first, I have in mind a model where there are political authorizing environments that supervise something like management in an international development organization or an aid agency that in turn supervise field level staff of those agency. And navigation by judgment to the cover is essentially discretion on steroids, right? It's discretion, if discretion meant not just making the liminal choice about the marginal case, figuring out how to interpret the information for this client, but rather substantively guiding what happens, the policy direction, the implementation channels from folks who are close to the ground. And one of the reasons I think navigation by judgment may be important is because navigation by judgment can incorporate soft information, which is stuff we can see, but we couldn't verify. We couldn't put numbers on and transmit up a hierarchy. I'll also talk a bit about environmental predictability and unpredictability. The idea there being that unknown unknowns imply greater returns to soft information, and the verifiability of tasks. So task verifiability is basically, in my language, like how well we could manage the project using top-down measures relative to other projects. Is it more like a road or more like capacity building? And that's it for terms. I'll now refer back to these over the course of the next little bit. And what I find is that insecure political authorizing environments matter. They cause organizations to manage up differentially, and they induce inefficiently large degrees of control and output monitoring. And that less navigation by judgment, less top-down control, and more navigation by judgment is helpful in a wide range of cases. But this matters depending on the nature of the country, how predictable, how legible it is, and the kind of task we're trying to do. So the right way to do the job depends on what the job is and where the job is, essentially. So another way of saying that would be to steal from a wise book that came out about a year ago this time, and talk about journeys, right? So talk about the journey without maps that perhaps some of you have seen in class, and the journey with maps, right? So can we think about the clear discrete steps we would engage in sequence to reach the destination from the origin? Does the map look more like this, more like what we would face today if driving from St. Louis to Oregon, or more like this, more like the map Lewis and Clark faced when driving from St. Louis to Oregon? And you know, the thing about Lewis and Clark is that if they had had Google Maps, they should have used it, right? It's not the case. The argument isn't that given both technologies, you're ever better off not knowing where you're going, not using the map. It's that if you don't have the map, trying to use the best available map as your primary guide is often not a good way of going about getting where you're trying to go. So the standard principal agent model tells us that we need to monitor and constrain our agents to keep them from using asymmetric information, things our agents know, but management does not, from doing bad things. We want to avoid shirking, we want to avoid sabotage, et cetera. But what if that information is critical to success? I think there are good reasons to think asymmetric information is an important part and undervalued part of what makes good outcomes in a variety of settings. So, intellectual hero of mine, personally, Jim Scott, seeing like a state can be read as an argument that the absence of ground level knowledge, the absence of asymmetric information leads to planning errors that lead societies astray. From the other side of the spectrum, Friedrich Hayek, the other side of the political spectrum perhaps, Friedrich Hayek's famous paper is actually called The Use of Knowledge in Society, right? That is his groundbreaking work, in which he writes, practically every individual has some advantage over all others in that he possesses unique information of which beneficial use might be made. And the claim here is, look, this isn't an idea of the right, it's not an idea of the left, it is an idea that we already have in the world, but we seem to forget about when we turn to how to manage our agencies, how to drive organizations to success, how to make aid more successful. And controls may preclude the use of information that principals can't see. It may bias people towards the observable, right? So if I have a task, part of which is measurable and part of which isn't, and I measure the measurable part of the task, I'm going to get more of that and less of the unmeasurable part. It may induce less collection of soft information. Why learn stuff you can't use productively? So the idea here is basically, I'm on the ground in a developing country. I work for a major aid organization. I could go out and figure out what's really going on regarding the project. But if I can't make use of the information I gather, why not stay in the compound and practice my backhand, right? It's not that I'm ill-willed, it's that why would I go through costly effort that will just frustrate me if I can't actually make use of whatever I figure out as a result of my sort of attempt to gather information. We also know that extrinsic motivators and a focus on sort of carrots and sticks can crowd out intrinsic motivation under some circumstances. So how should organizations choose a navigation strategy? So if you're a donor, how should you actually go about figuring out whether you should empower people on the ground and trust their judgment or control things from the top? Well, one part of it is, I think, fairly straightforward, which is when soft information doesn't matter and we can measure all the relevant parts of the project, that's what we should do. The first best solution, I would argue, potentially contra some other people in the room, I would argue that sometimes what we should do is measure as rigorously as we can and drive performance using available summary statistics. But I would argue we're not often in that world. And so what then? What should we do if we're the aid agency in this second best world we find ourselves? And it's not an easy choice, right? We have two flawed choices here. This guy on the right, by the way, my wife is Turkish, and the idiom here, does anyone speak Turkish in the room? So the idiom here translates to spit up, you hit the mustache, spit down, you hit the beard, right? And that's essentially the world donors find themselves in, right? It's not that like there's some awesome choice that I should make to just eliminate all the problems, right? It's that if I navigate from the top, if I manage from the top, I'm going to get standardized behavior, I'm going to get extrinsic motivation, I'll get this oversight and control, but I might lose this valuable soft information and induce these distortions. On the other hand, if I navigate by judgment, I'm going to get initiative and flexibility, and I might get more intrinsic motivation from my agents, but I'm going to have to rely on fallible agent judgment, right? So, of course, there's greater possibility that agents are going to go off the reservation and do the things I don't want them to do. But frankly, I suspect if each of us looks inside ourselves, we can find one example, big or small, in the last week where we have made a judgment and that judgment has been wrong, right? You could argue that behavioral economics is a subfield of economics devoted to pointing out all the ways human judgment naturally leads us astray without constraints, without structure. Judgment is fallible, right? And relying on it feels risky. When is that risk too much to bear relative to the alternatives? And one question to ask here is, so look, aid organizations, you might say to me now, look, aid organizations have been at this for a while, right? It's not like aid is a new idea. It's not like the first developing project happened last week. why wouldn't we expect the organizations just to naturally get this right over time, to come to whatever the right balance is of what to navigate, of how to manage when? And I have basically two answers to that. So the first answer is legitimacy seeking, right? So one of the reasons we control things is not to optimize performance, but to demonstrate performance. It's not about accomplishing results, it's about showing the results. And when we use controls and measures for those reasons, we have the potential to sort of use too much control in an attempt to validate our organizations in this way. Here in the US, the Government Performance and Results Act, which is the main kind of performance measurement act, actually states as its first purpose, not improving performance, but improving the confidence of the American people in the capability of government to demonstrate that performance. That's legitimacy seeking. It's not bad, it's not evil, but one of the reasons we measure results is so we can show that we did good things and have people say, hey, you're pretty okay, maybe we'll give you more money, maybe we'll not wind up your agency, maybe you have a political career after you run this agency, et cetera. In the world of aid, Bob Zoellick, when he was World Bank president, said, we know that focus on results is absolutely key for donors, by which he means the people who fund the World Bank. Indeed, that's the first group of people he mentions results are important for. So IDOs manage up to what I'm calling political authorizing environments, but that doesn't mean all political authorizing environments and thus all IDOs are created equal, right? So some organizations are more secure than others, and that creates heterogeneity, variation, that I can leverage to get at how much this insecurity is driving what happens. And thus IDOs are going to be differentially likely to engage in the error of too much control. And constrained navigation by judgment. There's one other reason I think organizations are going to get the balance wrong, which is not actually about aid or even about public agencies, but more about human nature, which is this. So if you buy my story so far, and if you don't, let's talk about that. I'd love to talk about that too. If you buy this story, then basically I'm arguing that if you have too little control, you're going to get things like agents making the wrong decisions, agents stealing things, agents not going to work, etc. All those things are observable. You can observe the wrong decision. You can observe the agent not showing up. Hopefully, eventually, you will figure out that the money has gone missing and know that, and look back and figure out how it's happened, right? However, the error of too much control is not visible in equilibrium. That is to say, the error of too much control is that it precludes the agent from doing something good they would have done but did not do because of the constraint. So we have two kinds of errors, which I'm going to argue are roughly symmetric. One creates an error, creates observable things that we can react to. The other doesn't, right? And so I think human nature is that we are going to respond to the bad headline, or not even, it doesn't have to be a headline, to the bad act by moving in the other direction, not realizing that our solution to problem A may induce more of problem B than it corrects of problem A. And that's just true of, I want to say, management writ large. So what does this add up to? I'm coming to the end of theory here, I promise. So what this adds up to is my argument here that organizations are going to err more on the side of too much control than they are on the side of too little. And that while all organizations are going to be one side of center, more insecure agencies are going to make even more of this error than the general set of agencies. And this error is going to have consequences which are going to vary by the nature of the task and the nature of the environment, right? So the more unpredictable the environment, the greater the returns to navigation by judgment, because you're going to be able to cope with things as they change using soft information on the ground. And the less the task can be pre-planned or managed using output numbers, the greater returns to navigation by judgment, because those numbers are going to be more distortionary when the task is less verifiable. Another way of thinking about 3 and 4 maybe as shorthand is, how much 2015 is there in the project and how much 1804? And it's kind of a good sort of summary way of thinking about the structure here. So here's the prediction in graphical form. A couple things. So the solid line is an agency that engages. This is based on no data whatsoever, by the way. This is just lines on an Excel chart, right? So, so the prediction here is that an organization that engages in a lot of navigation by judgment is going to see less of a decline as environmental predictability falls or task verifiability falls. That is, as environmental unpredictability rises, right? And that sometimes we will be better off with less navigation by judgment, and sometimes we will be better off with more navigation by judgment. That the answer is conditional. One other thing I want to point out about this graph is that both lines slope down. They just slope down differentially. So the claim isn't somehow that as we move, if a country erupts into civil war and becomes vastly less predictable, right? I'm not suggesting that any organization is going to suddenly improve their performance as civil war comes on, right? It's that the decline will be differential based on the organization's ability to cope with this kind of unexpected shock. So to test this theory, first I put together a big database. By big, it's 14,000 projects across 9 donors, across 50 years, across 180 recipient countries, across 200 sectors. Those of you familiar with the World Bank's PPAR data, think of that plus 8 other organizations that look like that. I'll talk more about that data in just a second. One thing I want to highlight here is you can go get the data. I put a couple hundred hours, and by I mean research assistants mostly, and me, put a couple hundred hours into cleaning this data and making it as user-friendly as possible. So except for the European Commission data, which I could not release due to a data agreement, the other 8 donors' data is codified and standardized with a code book in an attempt to help other people who want to think about kind of systematic performance across agencies, across organizations. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you about your future project on this. So those projects, those 14,000 projects, span much of the globe. Perhaps not a surprise to most of you in this room, but there are aid projects in way more places than most people think there are aid projects, right? I'm going to talk today about the 10,000 projects since 1994. So just briefly on the outcome data, I don't want to go I'm happy to go further in the weeds on data in Q&A, but the outcome data here is a holistic measure of project success. The project's given a success score like 3 or 4 or 6. That score can be generated by evaluation units, by contracted evaluators, or by project staff. The one problem is that it's not obvious that those numbers mean the same thing. So they map onto the same OECD Development Assistance Committee standard in theory. In practice, whether a German 4 is more or less than a British 3, I don't really think is something that these data can speak to reliably. So I always use fixed effects in thinking about these data at the organization level, at the agency level. So implicitly, I'm comparing within agency to make a between agency claim based on the difference of the slopes of the lines, right? In the way that we were talking about before. And when I don't do that, I use z-scores, IDEO-specific z-scores to standardize, which is basically just the same thing. So, and I make relative comparisons. On the right-hand side, for unpredictability, I use the Polity 4 measure, the state fragility index, the idea here being more fragile states are less predictable. It's kind of, actually the World Bank's definition of fragile states is essentially places that are less predictable. For my navigation by judgment measure, I use 2 measures, both of which are at the organization level, and I focus on the contingent relationship between them. What are those measures? So one is drawn from Paris Declaration monitoring surveys. I take questions that think about sort of freedom relative to political authorizing environments on the one hand, and propensity to devolve control on the other. So it's kind of, how much do you need to worry about politics as an IDO, right? And how much of a control freak are you as an IDO, as the 2 measures. That control freak line actually is from Beth Simmons, who is also on my committee. So amongst the things I owe her is this idea of control freakery in aid organizations. I then validate that measure with a small field survey of staff. So what does that field survey look like? It looks like somebody who deals with a bunch of donors, who works at like an aid management office, and thinks to themselves, who has more local control, the French folks I deal with or those British folks I deal with, right? Who needs to go back to the headquarters more to figure out what's going on? As to the results, I'll show you the results graphically in a second. This is mainly for the equation, for those who care about that. IS control for fixed effects. So here are the main results. And that looks like this graphically. So organizations, an agency with a lower navigation by judgment score sees more of a stark decline in response to increases in environmental unpredictability. And that's robust to using within country data. So it's both true across country, and it's true when we think only about how Benin has been doing over the last 30 years. Benin getting more and less fragile over that time period. Well, since 1994, so the last 20 years, but the point still holds. And this effect is clustered in more externally verifiable, in less externally verifiable sectors. So it's not building the road, it's the transportation management project that drives this effect. When we're building the road, this environmental unpredictability leaves us with kind of a messy answer. It's not clear which dominates the other systematically. In the transportation management project, we see much starker differences. I do a whole bunch of robustness, which I'm totally happy to talk about in Q&A. Just to highlight a couple of these, I control for evaluation type if, like me, you are worried about the quality of these evaluation data. I run placebo tests to suggest this isn't just kind of being a good donor generally, but specifically this kind of navigation by judgment thing. I also test to make sure there's no systematic selection by different kinds of donors into different donor sector country years, which would distort the ability of these data to tell us what I think they're trying to tell us. But let me turn just briefly, well, maybe for like 7 minutes or something like that, to case studies. So first, so I do 8 case studies in the book. I'll show you a schematic of them in a second. And so first, to kind of the central mechanism I'm positing, I do see evidence, I believe, of political authorizers mattering differentially and this linking to reporting. In South Africa, I see 13 mentions of Congress and 1 of Parliament. And of course, the number of mentions is kind of illustrative, but only illustrative, right? When I went back to the data, the first thing I thought when I came up with this number is, who mentioned Parliament? I actually don't remember anyone talking about Parliament. And the answer is, I did. So there was a interviewee who just kept talking about how Congress seemed to matter so much. This is somebody who had worked for both USAID and DFID projects, both US government and UK government aid projects. And those case studies, I should say, compare USAID and DFID across the 8 case studies. So I asked this guy, look, you keep talking about Congress, what about Parliament? Aren't people talking about them? Surely there's data on the other side. Surely people talk about the UK authorizers, political authorizing environment as well. And he said, not really. People talk about DFID, or something like that in the UK Parliament. Here's the mention of Parliament. But for USAID, it's about the Congress wants these numbers because they're providing so much for South Africa, and they want to know what it is that we have done with their money. And what I love about this quote is I don't think we need to read ill will into it. It makes perfect sense. If I gave somebody a bunch of money, I would want to know what they had done with the money, right? It's not, it doesn't have to be ignorance. It doesn't have to be a desire to do bad things on the part of political authorizers that drives this result. But we do see these kinds of tight reporting and accountability channels trickling all the way down to the field. On kind of US government authorizing insecurity and reporting, Andrew Natsios, a former administrator that is the head of USAID, described the agency as suffering from obsessive measurement disorder, which he describes as the condition where you think counting everything is going to make things better, right? Obviously resonates quite a bit with the argument I'm putting here. A PEPFAR official says when these targets are set from above, PEPFAR being the US government's President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, when these targets are set from above, everything flows down. Numbers have to add up to meet these arbitrary goals. Another interviewee describes USAID as an agency that's been under siege for 30 years now. And what happens when your agency is under siege, when you feel yourself needing to meet these tight reporting standards? It makes you cautious, right? It would make anybody cautious. It would make me cautious. If you have a boss who you think doesn't like you very much, you are going to be very careful about what you do so as to not give them reason to complain, so as to not give them reason to be upset with your performance. So I'm going to drill down briefly on two of the cases. These are South African municipal governance cases. So the idea here is both USAID and DFID want to help South African municipalities improve their debt management, improve their ability to manage expenditures, improve their kind of basic fiscal functions. They both go to an almost exactly identical number of communities. One goes to 16 communities, the other 18, with an almost exactly identical budget. It depends whether you use the exchange rate at the beginning or the end of the project period to see which is larger amongst the two projects, to try to do fundamentally similar things. So the goals of the project are essentially overlapping, but they implement in very different ways. So USAID implements their project primarily via training visits. We are going to send people out to provide trainings on the things we want people to learn. On the other hand, what DFID does is it sends out advisors. It sends out people who then go and live in these communities for a few years. So here's what they have to do. On the USAID side, the outputs, like what the official contract language says these folks are going to do, is train all staff on implementation of policy. On the other hand, the DFID advisors are going to they're going to advise and mentor people on achieving targets. They're going to unblock obstacles. They're going to achieve coherence, things that are obviously a lot harder to measure, a lot messier. And how are they going to begin delivering? Well, USAID, it creates a rota of training dates, of training information. I have many more pages than I would ever care to look at of names and dates of and figures. I can tell you who showed up at what community, on what day, for how long, to train about what, how many people showed up to the training, how many of them signed their name, how many of them were men, how many of them were women, how long was the training, how long was the lunch break, right? I can tell you how long, if there was lunch, I can tell you how much was spent on lunch. I can tell you pretty much everything about these trainings, except, of course, whether the people actually learned anything or did anything with that learning. On the other hand, for DFID, what these advisors do is they conduct an assessment of status quo and they prepare a report. And then how are these folks evaluated? How's reporting going to work for the project? Well, for the USAID project, we are going to call it a success if the staff are trained, that is, they receive a training, right? If the staff receive a training in the finance department and the municipal secretariat, which in practice means we're going to count people. On the DFID side, it means that advisors are going to implement their work plans and report on progress monthly and quarterly. So this actually, it's kind of the same task, but they go about it in very different and differentially verifiable ways, right? So USAID's, it's clear what's going to be counted. It's clear how that aggregates up. DFID, I mean, so if you're an advisor, what we're saying to you is go out, figure out what you need to do, then tell us how you're doing on how you need to do, right? So you get to write the test, take the test, assess how you're doing on the test, right? Which is not a terribly good standardized test. And it is not a standardized measure. It is a flexible one for better or for worse. So what happens? How do these kinds of two very different implementation modalities fare? Well, the USAID Deputy Chief of Party, so that is the number 2 on the USAID project, says the project might not have made the most dent or impact. One of the trainers suggests that the trainings may not have contributed much. And let me say that there are those in this room with much longer, more years of experience than I. But in my number of years talking to people about aid projects, right? It is pretty rare to have people tell you that the work they spent years of their lives doing had no effect, right? That's partially because you want to believe that if you've spent years doing something that it actually made a difference. And so I take these as fairly remarkable indicators of failure here. So the DFID project, on the other hand, is by no means a universal success. Some advisors do very little in their years in the field. Some, however, actually manage to make change. So why do I say that? Well, I say that because when you go back and you talk to the municipal managers, right, the mayor equivalents here, they remember the project. They can talk about what it did. Even there are a few communities that were served by both projects, right? No community was able to tell me, no no leader of a municipality was able to tell me what the USAID project did until I supplied the information, right? So it has made so little dent that people have no recall of it. We also see it in annual audit reports. Some of the municipalities in which DFID worked, but none of those in which USAID worked, see markedly better performance on their actual audits by the national government, Ministry of Finance, Department of Finance. So I agree broadly with the DFID report of this project, which is to say that although it's uneven in parts, there are some highly successful municipalities, some highly positive examples in selected municipalities. So it's not like we get universal success in one and universal failure in the other. But it is true that we get very little to show. We get close to that latter thing, universal failure. We have very little to show on the USAID side and something to show on the DFID side in doing similar things. So does that relate to navigation strategy and top-down control? Well, I think yes. So a different deputy chief of party, a different number 2 of the project, later in its life cycle, says that USAID indicators were chosen because they were easier to count, but those numbers didn't tell about the impact, and that they drove what happened. So it was a numbers game. USAID would say, we want the numbers, we want information. We would go out and get those numbers. Another implementer says it was more numbers chasing towards the end because we needed to reach our target. Reporting on performance undermined the actual accomplishment of the results. So stepping back, thinking about the qualitative results in sum, I see clear constraints stemming from political authorizing environments to agents. I see navigation by judgment linked to success, particularly in those hard to measure tasks and those kind of unpredictable or difficult to understand from the outside environments. I see evidence both of kind of soft information, of agents seeing what's on the ground and responding to it, and of organizational learning. So if I make a judgment call, then I can educate my judgment and make a better judgment call next time. If I don't, there's nothing to educate, right? If I had no control in stage 1, I can't learn about what I should have done better in stage 2 for the next project cycle. That's not to say navigation by judgment is perfect. You can't have too much, and in one pair, this South African health case pair, I end up arguing that PEPFAR effectively drove the US government to continue to focus on putting drugs in people's mouths, even as the South African government engaged in a kind of denialist era and was resistant to sort of policy level change around HIV/AIDS issues. And that in this case, navigation from the top-down management by measurement was absolutely the more effective strategy. So here are those, this is just my assessment of the projects based on the case studies. So red is DFID, blue is USAID. DFID does better in 3, the more navigation by judgment prone agency, does better in 3 of the 4 cases. That's the stylized graph I showed you based on no data at the beginning. And here are the quantitative results I showed you earlier. And I want to argue that these three sources of kind of information together, right? Theory, quantitative data, and qualitative data, all come together to suggest that there really is something going on here in which the optimal strategy depends on the nature of the task, the nature of the environment, and that often agencies get it wrong much more often in one direction than the other. So what are the implications? Well, political authorizing environments can induce suboptimally conservative behavior and constrain field agents. Measurement's a key tool of this constraint, and it is sometimes self-defeating. Navigation by judgment is contingently beneficial. Sometimes it helps you, sometimes it doesn't. And organizational structure and bureaucratic incentives matter. As we talk more and more, including in BSc, in CID, about unpacking the black box of implementation, one of the things we need to think about is organizational structure and management, very much in the developing world public sector, and also in the institutions that attempt to serve that sector in the aid agencies. One of the implications here is, tight management controls and these top-down constraints are likely to be particularly bad where at least I would submit aid is likely to be particularly helpful, right, in changing trajectories. That is the most fragile and post-conflict states. So just a couple broader implications. So look, aid agencies are public agencies. So beyond the world of aid, I think we need to think harder about what I call the reductive seduction and power of metrics. Numbers and quantification are increasingly a critical part of how our management systems work in the public sector and beyond. You know, I imagine a number of you, like myself, listen to the NPR podcast Planet Money, right? And Planet Money had a recent episode called The Future of Work is Like a UPS Truck, right? In which they talk about how UPS drivers are managed. So UPS drivers are told where to park on the street, that is parcel delivery drivers, right? Where to park on the street, which house to go to in which order, which way to load the truck, where to put boxes on their truck, which pocket to put their pens on, based on which hand they will be using more often, based on which doorknob, which side the doorknobs are on the doors to which they will be going. That may well be an effective way to manage the delivery of packages. It may well be. But not a lot of jobs look a lot like delivering packages, even in America, and certainly in Burkina Faso. And you know, when I think about sort of bureaucracy writ large, you know, I think of James Q. Wilson's path-breaking book now, I guess 35 years ago or so, called Bureaucracy, in which Wilson is very interested in the observability of outcomes and outputs as one of his kind of central concerns. And his example of public sector bureaucrats for whom neither is observable, for whom we can't see outputs or outcomes, are teachers and cops, right? So teacher measurement, you know, teacher value added is an industry that owes at least some credit, for better or worse, to the building we are currently standing and sitting in, we are currently in. And body cameras, the debate over body cameras has been a critical issue of policy over the past, I don't know, year, 5 years, et cetera, in the current public discourse. This isn't just a kind of aid issue in my view. It's not an issue that happens there. It's an issue that happens here as we think critically about what it means to drive good performance. And I'm not saying that body cameras are bad. I'm not saying teacher value added is bad. I'm saying that we need to think not only about what we gain, but also about what we lose when we employ these technologies. In terms of accountability, look, politicians are managers, right? They are managing the system. And reporting on performance can sometimes undermine that performance, whatever the sort of management style, management culture, place of management we're in, private, public, hybrid, or otherwise. And sometimes maybe we can get more juice with less squeezing, right? We can get more performance with less, not more control. So I promised Matt I would end on the cover. And I have to confess, Matt asked how I got this cover. And I have to confess, for a book about judgment, I engaged in a substantial amount of micromanagement of the cover design and photo. Does anyone recognize the photo by any chance? Gloucester, exactly. So, and thank you. I know I don't pronounce the name of the city right, but that's as close as I can get. So this is a statue in downtown Gloucester. Gloucester, not too far from here, is where The Perfect Storm, the book, happens, in the movie, right? This is a fishing community in part. And this statue is known locally as Man at the Wheel. It's a memorial to those who've lost their lives at sea. So about, I don't know, 4 years ago, as I was just starting to work on this book, I had the opportunity to walk Gloucester with one of its native sons, Peter Bell, who had worked for the Carter administration, Ford administration, and run CARE International for quite some time, run CRS for quite some time. I was talking about this broad idea. And Peter said, sure, yeah, it makes sense. I think it's true. It's true for aid agencies. It's also true here in Gloucester, where people have been, you know, sailing, and people have been fishing for generations, mostly by their wits. And in that light, what I like about this image, and the reason I found the photo, arranged the rights, formatted it, put it on the cover, and rearranged the cover design when I didn't like it afterwards, is because it's a memorial to people who have navigated by judgment and failed, right? They've failed in the most fundamental way possible, right? They have died. And we mourn their loss, and I believe the statue is entirely appropriate. But no one says that because judgment failed some fishermen, we should stop empowering fishermen to use their judgment. No one manages fishing fleets using GPS from some distant control room. The fact that navigation by judgment sometimes fails, there's no question there. Navigation by judgment sometimes fails. The question is, if we compare it to the next best alternative, is it the best we've got, even when it's imperfect? Thank you.
Oh, that's great. So I promised that we'd have some time for questions, and I think we have good time for questions. I think Dan's flat on these tomorrow evening, so we've got a long time. So let me tell you a little bit of a story and then end up with a question. So firstly, it sounds like I work for the wrong aid agency. I don't know, the World Bank. Maybe I should have gone to DFID. The first job I did in the World Bank, I had just finished my PhD, and armed with all this potential judgment, was sent to Croatia. And I had worked in the Ministry of Finance, and my boss said, I want you to go into the debt management office, and I want you to restructure it. And I said, but I never did debt management, right? I said, I worked in a budget office. And she said, yes, but you know what you're talking about, just go and do it. And I arrived there, and when I arrived in the office, it was a complete mess, and I didn't know what I was doing, but it didn't really look too difficult. And the first person who met me there was the head of the DFID office, who had been also asked to do the same thing. And he was a pretty lazy guy. And so he said to me, why don't you meet me for drinks this evening and tell me what you think should be done? And so I spent the day kind of developing a plan and a strategy and met him for drinks, and he said, this is great. And it turned out that he was a long-time civil servant in England, and then had joined DFID and had significant standing as having done this for a long time and survived, and got to the point in his career where navigation by judgment for him was find someone who I think kind of is a bit more energetic than I am, get their ideas and let them do stuff, right? And so I said, I think this is what we should do. And here's the senior person said, that's great. Why don't we pitch it together to the minister tomorrow, and given my standing, we will get an okay on this. And I said, that sounds fantastic. Like, it sounds great, right? And actually, he seemed, it's very strategic and kind of on the money. So then that night, I had to report back to Washington. And I reported back to Washington, and I said, this is what we're doing, blah, 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 blah. And I got this call. And it was from the head of the team on debt management, who was telling me that everything I was proposing was outside of the norms that the World Bank was doing on debt management, and that the IMF would not support what I was recommending. And that these were the boxes that needed to be ticked, and what was I doing on those boxes. And it was kind of this interesting thing where the next morning I went into the meeting with the DFID guy, and he said to me, he said, you joined the wrong organization, the one that looks over your shoulder and second guesses what you do. So let me ask the question, because before you spoke, I was saying to you, what frustrates me about many development organizations is they take bright people from places just like this, and they kill them. They destroy them, not by sending them to sea to do this, but by just destroying their spirits. By taking people who have been trained to have judgment and not allowing them to exercise it. Why do you think aid agencies like the World Bank would do this? I can understand USAID, where you have a Congress that is rarely holding you close, right? But an organization like the World Bank, some of the others, why do you think, what is driving them to do two things? One is to hire people who have this judgment, right? And to pride yourself on hiring these people, and then to not allow them to exercise it.
Yeah, so you've spent much more time, Michael has spent much more time inside the bank than I have. But let me say first, I couldn't agree with you more on the diagnosis, right? So that is, you see folks who come in, eager and bright-eyed, and either leave or turn into folks looking for their next R&R, the promotion from P3 to P4, et cetera, right? So the other way around, it's not important. So, I would say that one of the things that drove me to write this book was the realization that the kind of positive deviants, the positive outliers, often spend a lot of time fighting their organizations, right? So, you'd see a good agent in the field, and you'd realize they spent a ton of their time managing their own institution. And then I would meet the folks who ran institutions as I became more senior, and I would think, I don't know, I'm just meeting them, I'm no politician, but these seem like pretty good folks. And so they're good folks at the top, and they're good folks at the bottom, right, who want similar things. How come the folks at the bottom need to spend so much time fighting to do what I think the folks at the top want them to do? And I have a couple theories, some of which I can prove, some of which I can't. So on the prove side, I would say that the bank, I would say that there is still, kind of this authorizing environment constraint. I should say that I think it's this Monday, I'm giving a talk to the executive directors of the World Bank, to their kind of board summit, and I will let you know what they have to say about this argument. I also think on the I can't prove it side, I think with the bank specifically, this is a toy theory I'm never going to be able to prove, but I've seen, it seems to me the three organizations that I've seen suffer from the most extreme kind of this dysfunction are, I should say I'm from Detroit, are the car companies, right? The way auto companies manage their workers and manage their designs, parts of the military, and the World Bank. And there's one thing that unites all three of those, and that is Robert McNamara, who went from Ford to the Air Force to the bank, and indeed brought in the first results-based measurement at the World Bank. I have no idea what exactly that kind of cultural vector means, but I will say that, part of the way the bank has made itself an expert both to its own staff and to developing countries, is by being able to refer to the data, right? The data is the prized part of that equation a lot of the time. And I think it's a culture that reifies numbers, that reifies quantification when it is appropriate, which I very much believe it sometimes is, and when it's inappropriate. And so the idea that when I'm hiring somebody, want to pick really good people, but I then want to plug them into, or I can't help but plug them into a system that requires all of this data, feels pretty consistent to me. As I mentioned in the kind of getting the balance wrong bit, I think some of the problem is political, and I think some of the problem is just kind of human nature, the overcorrection to what you can see, to the area you can see. And frankly, I think there are plenty of other reasons to get this wrong too, including culture, including a bit of random walk, including leadership. I think it's hard to tell a different story without Claire Short in it somewhere. We can imagine lots of things that influence organizational culture and compliance. And I think we have not taught ourselves the skills of stepping back and thinking critically about our organizations. And we need to do better.
Before I go to the group to ask questions, one of the things I was thinking of also when you were talking about this kind of unseen loss, right? When you aren't allowing people to have their judgment. In reading the book, you're obviously focused a lot on kind of the loss is going to be of the judgment of the individuals who are involved, right, who work for these agencies. They aren't going to be allowed to exercise themselves and their abilities. And we're not going to see their brilliance. I was wondering, I think I'm toying with this idea of luck at the moment, right? And one of the things that I'm seeing is that when individuals in these emerging contexts, working for aid organizations, work according to their judgment with the people in those contexts, it's not just their talents that come out, they almost allow the talents of those people to come out, right?
Totally.
And there's an emergence of kind of new things. When they don't, it's not just that you're kind of killing the creativity of the individual. You're prohibiting that individual from having any kind of impact on the society around them. What do you think of that idea, and how? I'm speaking a little like Alice Evans now. How do we communicate that loss in a way that makes it very hard for development organizations to do that? Because it's not just what you're doing to your staff, it's what you're doing to the people of those countries.
Yeah. So the way I frame, I think, part of what you're saying here is constraint rolls downhill, right? Judgment can, right? Or empowerment can, but needn't necessarily. So that is to say, the empowered manager, the empowered country manager in a World Bank sense, could decide to empower his subordinates or not. The empowered subordinates could decide to work in a way with local politicians that empowered them or not, right? It can go one way. One way is possible. The other way is certain, right? And so how do we demonstrate that? Well, it seems to me we need to demonstrate it through some kind of, I don't know, aggregation of what these two methods look like, and call me an empiricist. So look, this project relies on data, right? So one question occasionally people ask is, okay, data's so bad. What about all this data that you just use, smart guy? And there's a little bit of truth to that. At the same time, the claim here isn't that we can't figure out if we're doing a better or a worse job. It's that we can't figure out in this way, in this time period, for these kinds of tasks. And so what I think we do is we pilot things, right? If we want to randomize the pilots, we can randomize the pilots, if that's going to help somebody believe the inference on the back end, right? And we see what different kinds of management structures do. We see what they do not just in kind of the results, but also in empowerment. We could develop scales if we really need to quantify them, or we can rely on judgment. The best way to judge if judgment has worked is to use judgment, right? I mean, and one of the things that this sort of speaks to is, the senior guy in your first story, right? So I really like him as you were talking, is he a bad guy or a good guy, right? So I think, so read one way, he is shirking and exploiting your labor. Read another way, he is marrying his ability to get political authorization with your better ability to diagnose the situation. Yeah. And ultimately, frankly, one of the things I love about academia is there's no time card, right? While I may put in a lot of hours, if on a Tuesday morning I didn't feel like doing that, I would not have to, right? And I think that, the question of judgment is it's pretty hard to take a snapshot of what you've done in 1 day or 2 days and say you are a good or a bad judge. Auditing doesn't really work. You either need to be there for the long term, gaining the same soft information in the same context, then you can make an assessment, or you need to come back after a while, let the horses run their race, see who got closer to the finish line.
Which raises the question about RCTs, but we won't get onto that. Because I think if an RCT is not going to be there for the long haul, and if it can't mix in with things over a long period of time, it may not be a good measure. But I won't. Lance is not here to validate me on that. Let me ask first. We have Professor Mansbridge and we have Professor Wilcock. In that order, Jenny, do you have any comments, thoughts?
Questions? I unfortunately have a student and couldn't comment a little late. And I can't remember whether you used Lawrence and Larsh's contingency theory in your analysis. Did you ever pick up on their work?
Yeah, so it is now buried in the endnotes, I must confess. But so basically, I think there are essentially at least 4 theoretic frames that get to this conclusion. So one is Lawrence and Lorsch contingency, right? Especially.
Those of you who, I don't imagine large numbers of people know Lawrence and Lorsch's contingency, but they were asking when participatory management worked, and they answered that it works when it works best in unpredictable environments.
Yeah.
That if you have an extremely predictable environment, participatory management is costly. There's various reasons why absolutely top-down management has been chosen. And it works, top-down management with absolutely clear-cut objectives and works best when it's the American Can Company and you've got a completely predictable environment. And if you're Hewlett-Packard and you're working in a very unpredictable environment where you have to be extremely flexible, then participatory management is a more effective style. That's comparable.
100%. And actually, it's great that you chose Hewlett-Packard as your unpredictable environment, because of course, the Hewlett-Packard way is something like hire good people, train them, trust them, That is like their mantra. Like, so it is almost exactly those words, right? Which is where contingency theory relates to something else from Lawrence and Lorsch's, I want to say 72, right? So relates to something else from management literature in the 60s and 70s that we would have done better to remember, which is McGregor's theory X and theory Y, right? So how we manage people depends on who the people are, right? And has a lot of echoes, if I might say, with your selection versus sanctions model and contingency theories of accountability. The idea that we can drive that way, it depends who the people are, and who the people are depends on how we manage them and how we reward them. If we make the job of being a legislator terrible, we're not going to get too many great folks who want to do that job. And so I would say this kind of Lawrence and Lorsch plus McGregor story gets you there. I think your contingency theory points in this direction. I think the soft information, Aghion-Tirole, Holmstrom-Milgram contract theory, which is what I've used here, points there. I also think, frankly, Jim Scott's discussion of METIS, local knowledge critical to making good decisions, is heading in this direction, as is, this is the last one I promise, as is Polanyi's view of tacit knowledge. And how we gather and collect tacit knowledge. I think there are a lot of these echoes. In some ways, you know, so at some point, when I interviewed for academic jobs, right, I also presented at business schools. And when I did that, eventually someone would say, okay, all this is really interesting, and I get that people don't use it, but what's new in this theory? And I didn't really have a good answer to that. In fact, my answer was like, well, what I think we're seeing is like the empirical application of that to, you know, 3/5 of the planet, right? And how their public systems run, right? And that feels to me substantively important, but absolutely. This is not, you know, some new theoretic element to you, though it is at times to the people who think about this space and the management of this space. But I 100% agree that this is where scholars of the 60s and 70s, there's Chester Barnard a little bit in here too, knew they were going, and somehow we forgot. We lost our path along the way.
Just quickly, because I can talk to you whenever I want. I guess there's an extension of that, saying it almost behooves all of us who are doing this stuff, because even in the work that Matt and Lance and I do, we don't claim deep originality with much of what we're saying, but that once you concede that, I think the next interesting question is, well, why, despite 50, 60 years, if you want to go back to Hirschman and to muddling through and all of that, we can all have, you can find strands of all of this in the literature, and then you sound somewhat churlish as an academic and say, well, of course, someone, X, Y said this back in the 1960s, what's new? No. And when I hear those kind of issues, I just say, well, why did none of this fail to dislodge what seemed to be baked in as a way of doing business, whether it's the World Bank or any other sort of high modernist organization, to use Jim Scott's phrasing of this. So I guess the question is to you, if we've known about this, we, the intelligentsia, have sort of known about this for so long, why has it failed to dislodge either the orthodoxy or find a complementary space, which is essentially what you're arguing for, and what we argue for as well, I think, is that you've got to have different ways of dealing with different kinds of problems. And so why has that been so hard to, it shouldn't be rocket science in one level, but it seems, and it isn't, but there's something so deeply impervious to the prevailing orthodoxy that just is allergic to doing so much of this. And so what's your sense of that?
It's totally speculative, but since you've allowed me, you've opened a kind of speculative door here. So, I mean, look, I think it's always been the orthodoxy. This has always been a minority position, you know, except maybe muddling through, but that's in a sort of specific domain. And I guess I think that the ability to prove yourself, right, under the kind of epistemic coin of the realm, right, has always been dominated on the other side, right? So, you know, that is to say, I say numbers don't matter, and you say, well, numbers matter, and here are these numbers that show me they matter, right? And so, like, you know, my answer, which is far from the only answer to that question, is twofold. So first, this problem has always existed, but now it exists on steroids, right? That is to say, we used to have all of these domains where judgment was present, right? Where top-down control was absent, not because somebody thought it was a better idea, but because it was not possible, right? So, you know, in the forest ranger, as long as we're going to that generation of the literature, the control mechanism in Herbert Kaufman's forest ranger, these are forest workers in parks, in US national parks. The control mechanism is we're gonna have people keep a journal, and then we're gonna come around every 3 months, 6 months, I can't remember the period, and look at the journal of what they've done. This is the tightest control mechanism we can come up with for forest rangers, right? So I was exploring a project, which in the end may not happen, in the Park Service now. They have GPS everywhere, right? I can see when you're on the trail. I can see what you did today. I can ask you to take photos. I can ask you to videotape what's going on. I can see when you return to the site. I can see how many supplies you used. You can imagine all the things I can see, right? So like, you know, there used to be these kind of zones of discretion, of judgment, that I think allowed the system to work, even when the system thought it was working through performance measurement, right? Yeah. Because they weren't good enough at getting rid of them. So Rosalind Eiben has a piece about development that argues this essentially, that like, you know, the successes of results-based management come because people ignore the results-based management part, and then they get called the successes. And I think, you know, the severity of the problem and the increasing severity of the problem as technology penetrates so many walks of our lives, I think that kind of ups the ante of the game, but I also think it makes more salient the problem. I mean, you know, what was in the news this week was Zuckerberg and in some ways technology and information and, you know, issues that are not quite here but at the edge. Because it won Best Documentary, was nominated, earlier this week I watched Abacus, right? I don't know how many of you have seen Abacus, but it's a movie about a Chinese bank, a bank in Chinatown, I should say, I'm sorry, in New York's Chinatown, that serves the Chinese community there, that makes loans based on judgment without sufficient documentation, then sells them to Fannie Mae. The loans don't default, but the documentation is flawed, right? Are they criminals? Are they exercising judgment, right? These issues are coming up more and more in our society because of the power of technology and monitoring to get there. And so I think that that's a reason now might be different than the past, to answer a slightly different question. And second, you know, in terms of how we demonstrate it, you know, for whatever it's worth, both in my like RCT, you know, sort of ways you could go forward with this and in this book itself, like I am okay with asking the instrumental questions, with saying how can we use the current coin of the realm, the current top of the epistemic pyramid, and say, hey, within the terms of the data you've decided is most valid, in the normative frame you've decided is most valid, here are indications that you're going wrong. There are things that are distorted and lost by adopting that frame, and I worry a little bit about that trade-off, which I don't really know how to evaluate systematically, and I would love wisdom on. But I do think there are ways that we can use numbers, that we can use the increasing methodological and econometric sophistication of our world to demonstrate the failure of traditional ways of doing things in the way that Lindblom and McGregor and Lawrence and Lorsch could not. All of those are purely qualitative books, as much speculation as they are a case study in some sense. These aren't new ideas, but they can be newly demonstrated by the very tools that make them more acute.
Oh. Thank you, Dan. This was fantastic. And I remember seeing this 2 years ago, and you've certainly become much better at presenting.
Thank you. Thank you. You were like, I got to minute 18 before I wanted to walk out this time, so yeah.
So one thing I really liked was kind of your characterization of secure versus insecure organizations. And I mean, I don't mean to pile on the World Bank, but kind of, especially when I worked in New Delhi and I worked primarily on infrastructure, kind of one of the big differences people in infrastructure talk about the World Bank versus the ADB by comparison is that one just happens to be louder and wants more attention for the work they're doing. And this was something I wanted to ask you about, that kind of, as you see this kind of metric-oriented nature of aid in particular increasing, do you see that affecting, at a macro level, the kind of projects they're willing to take on as well? I know that's not something you were particularly looking at, but you know, it's kind of like the juking the stats argument with police and teachers as well, right? That kind of you start focusing towards the outcomes that you can work on. And so if infrastructure is easier because you can measure roads or bridges and all of this, then you really need to train kind of a civil engineering core and all of these kinds of, create the culture, the capability, all of these kinds of things. And then kind of just a logical extension of that like one of the organizations that clearly, has come up in the last 10 years, which may not be part of your sample, but do you have any insight into kind of how new Chinese aid organizations or infrastructure lending organizations are thinking about these kinds of things? Because they're heavily focused on the infrastructure side as opposed to other things. Any insights on that?
Yeah, so on kind of whether we're changing what success means to meet a standard we can measure, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I don't know of some systematic way to look at it, and I haven't thought about it differentially across agencies. But I agree it's a problem. And
is there something in project selection that's happened over the last 2 decades that you've seen?
So not by sector. So I can tell you people aren't altering the sector of the project, but they're not altering what we can observe in terms of the macro data of the project over time, systematically, differentially. So that is to say, it's not that more insecure agencies are making different choices than the less secure ones. But, excuse me, whether conditional on doing a project that I call a transportation management project, whether that actually involves, improving soft management of the transportation agency versus, I don't know, putting in better communication technology so that people can talk to each other in the field, I can't observe that at the macro level. I share your suspicion, but I can't, I don't know, is the answer in some kind of systematic way. Yeah, so what do we, sorry, give me the second half again.
Just kind of any insight about Chinese aid organizations
Chinese aid.
in the last 10, 15 years in particular?
Yeah, so
thinking about these things.
So one thing that, as you point out, the Chinese are focusing predominantly on sectors where I would predict measurement does quite well. And frankly, in part stealing from that playbook, one of my recommendations for how we can get around this problem. So I think we should pilot new management techniques. I think we should think differently about measurement. I have all these kinds of inside a given organization arguments. But maybe the easiest thing we could do is, look, we talk incessantly, too much in my view, about donor coordination. Of course, the donor's coordination is the recipient country's monopoly provision, right? If you run one sector and I run the other, you Rohit only have one person to negotiate with and on each side, which is not maybe so good if we think of this as a bargaining game. In addition to providing a stalking horse to those bargains, what the Chinese example suggests is we can also allocate project types based on management rather than merely based on sort of who the interests of the particular country managers who are sitting around the table thinking about sectoral distributions or their bosses, right? And so maybe there's a world in which USAID does a lot of infrastructure spending and does less of a bad job of it than they would capacity building. And DFID does a lot of the management side of things, right? And so when two people show up in the debt management office of the new Croatian Ministry of Finance, they both are from organizations that are the right organizations in the view of Matt's former senior colleague. I think, and as to how they measure and monitor results, I would say it's remarkable how much the Chinese government has, at least thus far in its aid projects, adopted traditional norms and traditional standards around these things. Whether that's about sort of satisficing for now and we see a break later, I don't know. But it suggests the kind of potential deepness of this dysfunction, even with people who are very different, actors who have very different authorizing environments.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Haitham. I have a question with regards to countries affected by conflict or fragile states. That it's happening right now, like in Yemen and Syria. For an organization like is based in DC, how can we measure, what do you suggest to measure performance or impact in countries that the international organization does not have access to?
I would say we don't measure performance or impact, at least that way, right? So, I mean, and in terms of a better way to do aid in those countries, right? Hodan here in the audience knows we collaborated in part on a report about Hodan's native Somalia and the sort of ways aid is delivered in Somalia, right? So if in Somalia I'm going to deliver aid as an international organization. I hire an INGO to deliver that aid, right? That INGO then hires an NGO, but that NGO, that regional NGO, just can't go to the field, so they hire a local actor who can deliver the aid. I'm pretty concerned, though, about what's that local actor really doing? So I'm going to hire a third-party monitoring firm to help me figure out what that local actor is doing. And then now we've added something called verification of third-party monitors, right? Which I call fourth-party monitoring, right? So, because that's what it is fourth-party monitoring. So, my original concern, the reason I didn't trust the government or local actors was because I didn't want any of the money to go missing. And it is true, the INGO has written me a receipt for all of the money that went out the door, and the NGO has receipts that they write the INGO, and I have a perfect paper trail. Porter's Audit Society, as long as we're going to sort of historic literature on this. But the money that actually gets to the management of the firm that actually is doing the thing is like 20% of the money, 25% of the money, right? So exactly how big was my worry about money going missing? Because if I thought 100 cents on the dollar were going to go missing, well, okay, 25 cents on the dollar is still getting somewhere. That seems good, right? But if I thought that maybe only half of the money was going to go missing, then am I actually maximizing the effectiveness of my aid conditional on my own expectations, not on what somebody else thinks, what I think about where that money is going to go? How do I figure out whether that money's done a good job? Well, I can't go there. I can't send people there. My security rules mean, when I went to Somalia, right, I was in Somalia for 4 days, right? 4 days. And when I would go back to the airport, which is where all of the donors live, they live inside the airport compound. It's the green zone in Somalia. People who worked on the Ministry of Finance as professionals for years would ask me questions about how the ministries are working, right? I'd spent 4 days in the country. I knew nothing. I still knew more than people who, because of their own security protocol, because of their own security rules, could not leave about certain things, right? Not about the history of the system, et cetera, but about certain things. And it strikes me that as long as we're in that environment, what should we measure? Nothing, right? How will we know we're doing a good job? We don't, right? Whether we use quantitative or qualitative data, the question here is not how do we avoid ignorance. We are going to be ignorant, right? The question is, if we are all we're going to do, and I think there are reasons to think we can do better, but if all we're going to do is throw darts at the wall, let's at least be a little smarter from a theoretic standpoint about which darts are likely to hit home in which ways. And guess what? If we could actually trust people on the ground to tell us how things are going, if we could actually go to places and figure out what's going on, maybe we could do a little bit better that way too.
My name is Diana. I'm from Serbia, and I'm a mid-career student here. Obviously, navigating to find the wrong judgment not to take much interest in this course.
I didn't take either of the courses either.
I saw it, right, but yeah. Never mind. It comes sometimes, the organizations implementing and people implementing whether it's international organization or World Bank project in the field, they do have ideas, they do have judgment, they can consult. But what I see, there is no mechanism in order to move that up and to communicate it.
Yeah.
I personally had experience, with international organizations, just to show how ridiculous some things are. What would you suggest as a mechanism to collect data at the maybe lower level or the local level to see about these deviances, coming from, the country or the organization or the sector that could be maybe implemented at the higher level and kind of relax people who needs to have all the things under control and therefore all the indicators placed, to implement throughout the world. To kind of relax and say it's okay, let's just, do it this way, or as you said, the pilot. What would be the mechanism to work bottom up?
Yeah, so first, I am cynical. It's the institutionalist in me. I'm cynical about attempts at something like feedback or bottom-up information that continue to leave the same actor empowered, right? So that is to say, when feedback is an input into some elites, especially some foreign elites, decision about what happens, right? Then, like all of us, we are going to take the information that we like and discard the information that we don't. A contemporary example here in the U.S., at the risk of certainty of inducing controversy, an unpopular view of mine is, I think Facebook did terrible things with people's data. I think it mattered not one whit, right? I look at what Cambridge Analytica did with that data, and I say, this is meaningless nonsense. I look at their former clients who say it's meaningless nonsense, right? And it leads me to believe that this breach matters as a policy matter, but not as an election affecting matter, right? But of course, I'm a liberal. And so the media I've been consuming about this for the last 4 days has not mentioned the ineffectiveness of this. Indeed, Fox News and others like it have been much, in my view, more accurate in reporting that part of the information. So we have certain kinds of data. We focus on the parts of the data that reinforce our views of the world. I think that's what everyone does, and that's true not necessarily because of ill will of donor elites as well. And so if the scheme is, how do we let the people who make the decisions know what's going on the ground so they can decide whether to be more helpful? Well, I think if we can, we should ask the broader question of how we change the power relationships and the control relationships in the first place. If we can't do that, then I think we're much better off finding champions than we are sort of giving data to the system, right? That is, finding well-disposed folks who are willing to accept the nature of the problem, right? And figuring out what they need to make the argument within their own organizations. And what that means is going to vary, right? So, you know, in one of my favorite examples, when Alastair Moon, when he was an advisor to the government of Uganda, I don't know, 15 years ago, something like that, wanted to, longer again, 25 years ago, wanted to make the point that there were too many missions coming in, he started counting them, right? And he showed exactly how much time and how many people were required to deal with this. He made visible, he made legible, to use Jim Scott's language, to the organization what it was doing wrong. I once asked Alastair why he did that, and his answer was, I was talking to somebody and I asked them what would it take to stop the missions, and they said, you have to show us the damage of the missions, and they figured out a way to demonstrate that damage, right? But was that the right data universally? No. It depended on what that person and that organization thought was going to move the needle. And so I don't think there's a general answer to what the right kind of data is. And I think, frankly, as the world is set up now, we just kind of have to hope there's someone in the system who wants to change things or is willing to listen. Because if there isn't, all the feedback in the world is just going to be a nice report where people cherry pick quotes and justify what they already wanted to do in the first place. Forgive the cynicism, but that's my view.
Let's have one last question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. My name is Daniel. This has been extremely interesting. I'm curious what you think is the most compelling critique to your analysis.
Well, that, you know, the cover is just too black and white. So, you know, it's a difficult critique. I struggle with it. But what do I think is the most compelling critique? Do you mean in like an internal validity sense or in a where we take it sense?
Well, I'd be curious which among the two, right? It could be an internal validity, or it could be an implication of it. But where do you think the potential weaknesses might be?
It's a really interesting question. Do you ask that as a standard question of people? You should. It's a good thing to ask people. So I may steal that. I'll credit myself by way of saying I credit Daniel for this idea whenever I use it. So I would say from like an internal validity standpoint, look, if you don't buy the theory at all, right? If this doesn't conform to your intuition, right? I think these quantitative data and qualitative case studies are good enough in a Bayesian sense that you should update your priors, right? But if you really believe that this is, you know, if you are, this is a public recording? If you are really the kind of person, whoever that person might be, not that I was about to mention anybody by name, that is not going to believe this idea, I don't think that I can approach kind of what I would call economist level, I don't know, doctrinaire economist level rigor. So there's a reason that I started out my PhD career thinking I was going to be an economist and ended up being a political scientist. It's because at the end I decided what I wanted to do was answer the questions. I take it you're a PhD student? Is that right? MPAID. So I decided at some point what I wanted to do was answer the questions I thought most important in the most rigorous way I could, rather than restrict my view to the questions I could answer rigorously enough to get it published in the QJE, right? But that means that there is a difference in that standard of rigor by my own assessment. If other people had better data, I would use it, but I don't. But if you're truly a doubter, if you truly fundamentally believe this argument is wrong, at the end of the day, I have to say, well, okay, I guess we disagree. I can't say, I am sure you are wrong about that argument. I'm sure in a kind of theoretical, my sense of the world way, but as the book argues, judgment sometimes fails, and it is certainly possible that mine is failing me here. To in an external validity sense, I would say the question is, so I make a lot of scope in the recommendations and in the way I talk about the book for the idea that conditional on the politics we have, we can make things better, right? But frankly, not a lot of people have tried to do that in the direction I'm suggesting. And again, I'm an empiricist, so I can't really evaluate things that haven't happened, right? So I can't tell you how something that could happen but never happened is going to do. And so I'm making a series of recommendations here that suggest that, though of course if we could change the nature of political authorizers, that would be great, there are a series of things we can do with the hand we've got. That our options are not just to hold them or to fold them, but also to draw a couple new cards and change the nature of the composition of the hand, right? And that is, frankly, ultimately speculative. And what I hope is that there are wise, enlightened folks at aid agencies, at foundations. I gave a talk at Hewlett Foundation last week in which the last 10 minutes was called ways I think the Hewlett Foundation could change, right? To take advantage of these recommendations. And that's my strategy when I present at agencies, right? Here's what we could do differently. Let's talk about doing it, right? Let's have that conversation in the Q&A or afterwards or at any time later. I need that to happen to be more sure that I'm right it can happen. I believe it can happen. I hope it can happen. But now it really is on the kind of hope and belief side. The hopey-changey thing, as we used to say in the Obama era, rather than fact.
When you're speaking now about folding, today Michael and I were sharing a set of emails where Michael was quoting Kenny Rogers' song "The Gambler" to me. Is that what it's called?
That's the song I'm drawing from here. Yeah, exactly.
I think my response multiple times was just Kenny Rogers in capital letters with question marks. But
related to that, if I could say, I know there are a few people with East Timor experience in the crowd. If somebody can explain why Alan Jackson is the most popular singer in East Timor to me, that is a mystery that I've always wanted to know more about. So anyway, I'm sorry.
So I think, I'm going to kind of bring us to a close so that people can also chat with you afterwards. And we want to do an interview with you. To me, I think this final question is interesting, and I do think one of the things that you are going to run into is people say you're critiquing data, using data. You raised that yourself. You know that's I critique the PIFA stuff, and people say, but you use the PIFA stuff, and I'm like, isn't it wonderful, right? It's like I do think though your book is an interesting one that part of your work is interesting to me is to kind of think about where it fits. And who are you trying to mobilize, and who are you trying to impress?
Yeah.
And I get the idea of saying we're going to go up to kind of the top, and we're going to see what is the coin of the realm, and we're going to try and convince people in that. Some of the best political science has kind of done that to a degree, but it's also mobilized the people about whom it is written. And I think that your book is that. And I think that you should certainly be trying to be as rigorous as you can be, and I think that you have a high level of rigor that is really commendable. But I think that the influence of this book is going to be more, this book is more like Wilson to me. This is James Q. Wilson. This is writing about bureaucracy for bureaucrats and for political scientists. In a way that rigorous people have to pay attention, because the people that they're writing about are saying, hey, this is me. And I think that that's why this is powerful. And I think for development, this is that book to me. And that, you know, when you do get the critiques from the people who are saying it's not this or this in terms of rigor, the key thing is going to be the counter of the people who live this day by day and who say actually it's real.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where the impact of this is going to be, particularly this book, but your work in general. And I think, you know, that's kind of one of my favorite books of all time. I think it's one of the best theoretical books. I think it's, and I think that this is kind of, this is where I would put this for development.
Thank you.
So, you know, while you're coming to places like this, I would say when you go to the bank, you know, spend as much time with the staff as possible.
Yeah.
Help them, let this help them to rise up, right? Because maybe if they're the ones who rise up and who take the data and who say, give us more space for judgment, that's where this has its biggest impact. It's a really great piece of work, Dan.
Thank you.
And we are very proud of you, and we are very proud that this work comes from us, and in some strange way, in some small way, and looking forward to many more books after this.
Thank you so much.
I don't think you'll get a better cover, but congratulations.
And thank you so much. And it comes in more than a small way from you. And if I could say one conversation I'm always excited to have is somebody who is inside the system or talking to people inside the system who want to see ways to make change. I mean, I didn't write this book. While I hope someday to gain this thing called tenure, right? Like, I did not write this book for that. I wrote it to kind of try to influence how these organizations work. And if anyone here, if anyone who knows anyone here is ever talking about these kinds of ideas, and I can be a fruitful part of the conversation, I would love to be. And for those of you who want to pick up the book, there are some flyers outside if you do want to order it. If not, no worries at all, of course. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much for having me.